September 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal, midnight, private first class. Robert Leckie lay in his foxhole listening to the jungle scream. Something in the trees was making a sound like a woman being murdered. Higher pitched than human, but close enough to trigger primal terror. It had been going for 10 minutes without pause. His finger rested on his rifle trigger. Every muscle was tense. His eyes strained into darkness, trying to see what was making that sound. Was it an animal? Was it a Japanese soldier imitating an animal? Was it dying wounded, making inhuman noises? He couldn't tell. Another sound joined the first. This one was closer. A rustling in the undergrowth. Then a crack, like someone stepping on a branch. His whole squad was awake now. Rifles pointed into blackness, waiting, listening, unable to determine if they were about to be attacked or if the jungle was just being the jungle. This went on every night. The sounds never stopped, the fear never eased, and slowly it broke them. This is the story of how jungle sounds destroyed soldiers' minds as effectively as bullets destroyed bodies. Humans evolved on savannas and grasslands. Jungle soundscapes are alien and overwhelming. A temperate forest at night is relatively quiet. You hear wind, occasional animals, but long periods of silence. The tropical jungle is the opposite. It produces constant layered sounds at varying volumes and frequencies. Insects create a baseline drone that never stops. Birds call at all hours. Animals move through vegetation, creating rustles and crashes. The noise is continuous and chaotic. This wall of sound prevents sleep and makes threat detection impossible. Humans identify danger through hearing. We distinguish between normal sounds and threatening sounds. But in jungle, there is no normal baseline. Every sound is unfamiliar. Every noise could be a threat. This creates a state of hypervigilance that the brain cannot sustain for extended periods. American Marines landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942 encountered Pacific jungle for the first time. Most came from North American or European backgrounds where forests were familiar. The jungle soundscape was unlike anything they'd experienced. The first nights were sleepless as men listened to sounds they couldn't identify and assumed each one was Japanese infiltrators. Japanese soldiers had more experience with tropical environments, but they weren't immune to jungle sound stress. Japanese troops from urban areas or temperate rural backgrounds found jungle as alien as Americans did. The sounds affected them similarly, creating the same exhaustion and paranoia that destroyed sleep and sanity. Tropical birds produce vocalizations that sound mechanical, human, or simply wrong. The kookaburra's call sounds like maniacal human laughter. Hearing this at night triggered immediate fight response in soldiers who thought they were hearing enemy troops mocking them. The bird's call carries long distances and seems to come from everywhere simultaneously, which made locating the source impossible. Parrots and cockatoos produced harsh screeching that sounded like metal on metal. The volume was shocking. A flock of cockatoos taking flight created noise like a machine gun battery opening fire. Soldiers hit the ground thinking they were under attack when it was just birds. Some birds mimicked sounds. They reproduced human voices, machinery, and gunfire. Soldiers heard what sounded like someone calling for help and would search for wounded comrades only to discover it was a bird. The psychological impact of being tricked repeatedly by bird calls was corrosive. Men stopped trusting their hearing, which made actual threats harder to identify. The jungle crow in New Guinea produced sounds that ranged from normal cawing to noises described as demonic. One call sounded like a baby crying. Another resembled someone choking. Soldiers hearing these sounds at night while exhausted and stressed interpreted them as wounded men dying. The emotional response was severe even after men learned it was just birds. Sergeant Eugene Sledge described lying awake on Peleliu, listening to birds that sounded like they were saying words. His exhausted brain tried to parse meaning from random sounds. He heard, "help me," and "over here" in bird calls. He knew it was auditory hallucination caused by sleep deprivation, but he couldn't stop his brain from finding patterns in noise. The constant, high-pitched whine of insects was inescapable and psychologically wearing. Mosquitoes produce a characteristic whine when flying near human ears. In areas with heavy mosquito populations, this whine was constant. Hundreds of mosquitoes flying around produced overlapping whines at slightly different frequencies that created dissonant sound that was impossible to ignore. Cicadas in tropical areas produce sounds exceeding 100 decibels. That's comparable to a chainsaw at close range. When large cicada populations synchronized their calls, the volume made normal conversation impossible. Soldiers shouting to be heard over cicadas couldn't maintain this for extended periods. The noise caused physical pain at close range. Crickets and other night insects created layered chirping that varied in rhythm and pitch. The sound was loud enough to prevent sleep, but not loud enough to mask other sounds completely. This created worst possible acoustic environment where soldiers couldn't sleep from noise, but also couldn't hear approaching threats because insect sounds masked footsteps and movement. The constant insect noise also masked tinnitus symptoms that many soldiers developed from artillery and gunfire exposure. Men couldn't tell if the ringing in their ears was from hearing damage or from actual insects. This created anxiety about permanent hearing loss that added to accumulated stress. Private Robert Leckie described reaching a point where he wanted to scream to drown out the insect sounds. The noise was driving him insane, not because it was loud, but because it was inescapable. Earplugs didn't work because you needed to hear actual threats. You had to endure the noise while trying to distinguish meaningful sounds from meaningless insect drone. Creatures soldiers never saw produced sounds that triggered primal fear responses. Fruit bats taking flight sounded like sudden wind or wings of enormous size. The sound came from darkness overhead, without warning. Soldiers looked up, expecting attack from above, and saw nothing. The psychological impact of hearing something large moving above you that you can't see or identify was severe. Wild pigs crashing through undergrowth sounded like a squad of men running. The noise triggered immediate combat response. Soldiers went on alert, established defensive positions, and prepared for attack. Then nothing happened. The pig was long gone. This false alarm pattern repeated nightly and trained soldiers to question their perceptions. Monkeys howling created sounds that resembled human screaming. The volume and pitch were very close to distress calls. Soldiers hearing monkey howls thought they were hearing comrades being killed. They'd rush toward the sound and find only animals. After several iterations, men stopped responding to what sounded like screaming, which created risk they'd ignore actual cries for help. Tree frogs produced sounds like wooden blocks being struck together. The regularity and mechanical quality made the sound seem artificial. Soldiers thought they were hearing signal codes or communication devices. They'd listen for patterns trying to decode messages that didn't exist. This wasted mental energy and contributed to paranoid thinking. Corpsman Eugene Sledge wrote about a sound on Peleliu that no one could identify. It was a low moaning that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Some men thought it was wind through caves. Others insisted it was voices. The sound appeared most nights and drove men to near hysteria trying to locate its source. They never determined what made it. Japanese forces deliberately used jungle sounds to mask movement and create psychological pressure. Japanese doctrine emphasized night infiltration. Small groups would move through American lines after dark using jungle sounds for cover. They'd advance when loud animal noises masked their movement. They'd freeze when the jungle went quiet. This made their approach nearly impossible to detect through hearing. Japanese soldiers also imitated animal and bird sounds to communicate without using radio or voice. They'd learned local fauna and could reproduce calls well enough to fool American listeners. A bird call might be an actual bird, or it might be Japanese troops coordinating an attack. Americans couldn't tell the difference. This uncertainty was psychologically devastating. If you couldn't trust your ears to distinguish real threats from animal sounds, you had no reliable way to detect danger in darkness. Soldiers became paralyzed by indecision. Should they fire at sounds and potentially give away positions while wasting ammunition on birds? Or should they hold fire and potentially let enemy approach unopened? Some Japanese units used sound as deliberate psychological weapon. They'd make noises in the jungle surrounding American positions throughout the night without attacking. The constant noise prevented sleep and created expectation of attack that never came. By dawn, the Americans were exhausted from staying awake all night. Then Japanese would attack when defenders were too tired to fight effectively. The Japanese also used actual wounded or dying soldiers as psychological weapons. Wounded men left in jungle near American positions would call for help in English learned phonetically. Americans hearing cries for help faced terrible choice. Was this a wounded comrade who needed rescue? Or was it a Japanese trap baited with a wounded man whose death was being weaponized? Either way, the sounds were traumatic. Repeated false alarms from misidentified sounds degraded unit effectiveness through exhaustion. A squad on night defense would hear sounds and go to full alert. Rifles ready, eyes searching darkness, adrenaline surging. They'd maintain this state for minutes or hours until they determined the sound was not a threat. Then they'd try to relax and sleep. Within minutes, another sound would trigger the cycle again. This pattern repeated all night, every night. Units in jungle positions averaged 2 to 3 hours of broken sleep per night. The rest of the time was spent in varying states of alertness, responding to sounds that were usually not threats. The cumulative sleep deprivation caused hallucinations, impaired judgment, and physical exhaustion. Officers tried to establish protocols for when to respond to sounds and when to ignore them. These protocols failed because the threat was real. Japanese did infiltrate. The sound that was a bird tonight might be an infiltrator tomorrow. You couldn't safely ignore any sound without risking death. Some units adopted philosophy of firing at anything that sounded suspicious. This wasted enormous amounts of ammunition shooting at birds, pigs, and falling branches. It also gave away positions and created risk from ricochet. But psychologically, it felt better than lying in the dark, listening to threatening sounds without responding. The stress from constant false alarms created hair-trigger responses that led to friendly fire incidents. Soldiers so keyed up from repeated alerts would fire at movement or sound without proper identification. Americans shot other Americans who'd gotten up to urinate or check positions. The jungle sounds had wound men so tight they became dangers to each other. Extreme sleep deprivation causes the brain to hear sounds that aren't there. After several days of minimal sleep, soldiers began experiencing auditory hallucinations. They heard voices calling their names. They heard orders being given. They heard music. These hallucinations were indistinguishable from real sounds, which made them impossible to dismiss. The hallucinations often incorporated real jungle sounds. A soldier would hear his name being called in the wind through trees. The actual wind sound was real, but the voice was hallucination. This blending of real and imagined made it impossible for victims to determine what was actual threat and what was their brain misfiring. Some hallucinations were terrifying. Soldiers heard screaming, crying, sounds of combat that wasn't happening. These phantom sounds triggered real physiological stress responses. Heart rate increased. Adrenaline flooded the system. The body couldn't distinguish between real and hallucinated threats, so it responded to both with full fight-or-flight activation. Medical officers recognized auditory hallucinations as symptom of severe combat fatigue. Soldiers reporting hearing voices were usually evacuated from the line for rest and evaluation. But in the jungle, almost everyone was sleep-deprived enough to hallucinate. The question wasn't whether you heard things that weren't there, but whether the hallucinations impaired function enough to require evacuation. Private Eugene Sledge described hearing his mother calling his name from the jungle on Peleliu. He knew she was thousands of miles away. He knew it was hallucination, but he heard it clearly and had to fight the urge to respond. The sleep deprivation had damaged his brain's ability to filter out false sensory information. Not everything heard in jungle was harmless, which made paranoia rational. Japanese infiltrators did move through positions at night. The sounds of movement were real threats that required response. Soldiers who survived jungle warfare developed ability to distinguish between normal jungle sounds and sounds made by humans trying to move quietly. This skill saved lives but took time to develop and wasn't fully reliable. Wounded men calling for help were sometimes comrades who needed rescue. Ignoring cries for help because you assumed they were Japanese traps meant potentially abandoning wounded Americans. But responding to every cry meant walking into ambushes. The moral and tactical calculus was impossible. Some animal sounds indicated genuine danger. A certain type of bird would go silent when humans approached. Experienced jungle fighters learned that sudden silence meant something or someone was moving nearby. The absence of sound became as meaningful as sound itself. This added another layer of complexity to acoustic threat assessment. Booby traps created sounds when triggered. A tripwire being disturbed made specific noise. Hearing that sound gave split-second warning before explosion. Soldiers who learned to recognize these sounds gained marginal survival advantage. But the learning process required surviving several near misses where the sound was recognized too late. The fact that some sounds were real threats meant soldiers couldn't dismiss the jungle soundscape as harmless. They had to stay alert to actual dangers while somehow not being driven mad by constant false alarms. This was nearly impossible psychological balancing act. Unit leaders had no good solutions for jungle sound problems. Orders to ignore sounds and get sleep were impossible to follow. The sounds were too loud, too strange, and too potentially threatening. Soldiers couldn't voluntarily turn off their threat detection systems just because an officer ordered it. Rotating guards so some men could sleep while others stayed alert helped marginally. But the jungle was so loud that sleeping men were awakened by sounds regardless of whether they were on guard duty. The noise penetrated sleep and created fragmented rest that wasn't fully restorative. Some units tried creating additional noise to mask jungle sounds. They'd run generators or play radios. This worked in rear areas but wasn't practical on the front line where noise discipline was tactically necessary. Even in rear areas, adding more noise just created different acoustic environment that was similarly stressful. Medical officers prescribed sedatives to help soldiers sleep through jungle sounds. This created new problems. Sedated soldiers couldn't wake quickly if attacked. Units couldn't afford to have significant numbers of men incapacitated by medication. The drugs helped individual soldiers but degraded unit readiness. The only real solution was removing units from jungle to rear areas for rest. But rear areas also had jungle sounds just without the imminent combat threat. The acoustic environment was unavoidable unless soldiers were evacuated completely from the theatre. This wasn't logistically feasible for most troops. Japanese forces experienced the same sound-related stress as Allied troops. Japanese soldiers from urban backgrounds found jungle soundscapes as alien as Americans did. Post-war interviews with Japanese veterans included descriptions of sleepless nights, listening to incomprehensible animal sounds, and trying to distinguish real threats from jungle noise. Japanese units also experienced false alarms and wasted ammunition shooting at sounds that turned out to be animals. Japanese after-action reports mentioned problems with soldiers firing at birds and pigs. The same acoustic confusion affected both sides equally. Japanese soldiers developed auditory hallucinations from sleep deprivation, just as Allied troops did. Japanese medical records documented combat fatigue cases that included hearing voices and other sounds that weren't present. The human brain responds to severe stress similarly, regardless of cultural background. One advantage Japanese troops had was some came from areas with similar jungle environments. Soldiers from tropical or subtropical regions of Japan and Japanese-controlled territories had some familiarity with jungle sounds. This gave them marginal advantage in acoustic threat assessment compared to Americans and Australians from temperate climates. Many veterans developed permanent sound sensitivity from jungle warfare. Soldiers who served in Pacific jungles often developed hyperacusis, increased sensitivity to sounds. Normal environmental sounds that most people ignore became triggering stimuli that cause stress responses. Veterans would react with alarm to bird calls, insect sounds, or nighttime animal noises. Some developed specific phobias around sounds that resembled jungle experiences. The sound of wind through trees could trigger panic attacks in men who'd associated that sound with danger. Cicada sounds created anxiety in veterans who'd endured cicada-filled jungles where the noise prevented sleep and masked threats. Sleep disturbances persisted for years after the war. Veterans had difficulty sleeping in quiet because they'd adapted to sleeping through jungle sounds. But they also had difficulty sleeping with environmental noise because it triggered hypervigilance developed in combat. Finding acoustic environment that allowed restful sleep was ongoing struggle. The condition wasn't well understood at the time. Veterans suffering from sound-related anxiety were often told they were being irrational. There was no treatment framework for acoustic trauma. Men suffered in silence or developed coping mechanisms on their own, often involving alcohol or isolation from sound-rich environments. Contemporary military psychology recognizes acoustic stress as legitimate combat trauma. Research has validated that constant exposure to threatening soundscapes causes measurable psychological damage. The stress is cumulative. Each night of sleep deprivation and false alarms adds to total burden that eventually exceeds coping capacity. Modern military forces train for acoustic environments before deployment. Soldiers learn about local fauna and typical sounds they'll encounter. This familiarization reduces but doesn't eliminate the stress, because knowing intellectually that a sound is probably just a bird doesn't stop the lizard brain from reacting with fear. Sleep deprivation from acoustic stress is now recognized as serious degradation of combat effectiveness. Units are rotated out of high-stress acoustic environments more frequently than was done in World War II. The improved rotation schedules reduce cumulative damage from sleep deprivation. Treatment for veterans with sound sensitivity has improved. Cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy can help reduce hyperacusis and sound-related anxiety. Understanding the physiological basis for these reactions has led to better therapeutic approaches than were available to World War II veterans. The lesson from Pacific jungle warfare is that the human auditory system evolved for different environment than tropical jungle. Soldiers, operating in jungle face acoustic stress, that their neurology isn't equipped to process effectively. This creates psychological casualties as reliably as bullets create physical casualties. Jungle sounds drove soldiers towards psychological breakdown through constant acoustic assault that prevented sleep, created endless false alarms, and made threat detection impossible while knowing that some sounds represented genuine danger, requiring response. That environment, described in countless veteran accounts as more psychologically damaging than combat itself, proved that warfare extends beyond bullets and bombs to include neurological warfare waged by soundscapes humans didn't evolve to process. If you found this story compelling, please like this video and subscribe to World War II Archives for more untold stories from the Second World War. Leave a comment telling us if you knew jungle sounds caused severe psychological trauma. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.